As Daesh claims another one-off attack, this time in Germany, we ask whether lone wolves are the new faces of global terrorism. Also on today's program, silenced for good. We look at the murder of social media star Kandil Baloch by her brother. And in Picture This, Trump supporters and detractors go head-to-head at the Republican National Convention. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. It's becoming a pattern all too familiar now. An individual, often with a petty criminal background, wages an attack on civilians. Sometimes using bombs or guns, other times with a moving vehicle or a knife. And soon after, Daesh, the terrorist organization also known as ISIS, claims responsibility. In the latest incident, a 17-year-old Afghan asylum seeker is accused of injuring 5 people after attacking them with an axe and a knife on a train in Germany. Daesh claims he was one of their followers, as they did after a man killed dozens of people when he drove a truck through a National Day celebration in the French city of Nice. And as they did as well after the mass killings at a nightclub in Orlando last month. On today's Newsmakers, we ask how Daesh is changing the global perception of terrorism.
An attack on a train in southern Germany. A man wielding an axe and knife struck out at passengers. He injured at least 4 people inside the train, 2 of them critically, and a woman outside the train as he fled. The man was shot dead by police. He's been identified as a 17-year-old Afghan refugee who was living with a foster family.
In
the first emergency mobile phone call from the train to the emergency services, an eyewitness said the perpetrator shouted, "God is great." Further to this, a hand-drawn Daesh flag was found in the perpetrator's room when it was searched.
While his motive is still under investigation, Daesh has claimed the teenager was one of its members. But does a claim of responsibility from Daesh really mean anything? The attack in Bavaria is the latest lone wolf attack to be claimed by Daesh. It says one of its members was behind the attack in Nice last Thursday, when a man drove a truck through a crowd celebrating Bastille Day. And it claimed the attacker who opened fire at a gay nightclub in Orlando last month was one of its fighters. But there's no evidence that Daesh gave direct orders or organised any part of these attacks. In the age of Daesh, the definition of terrorism is widening. No longer just the work of organised terrorist cells, but individuals inspired, sometimes only loosely, by the group. If Daesh can claim responsibility for attacks without any direct link, when is a Daesh militant actually a Daesh militant? And how do we combat this changing landscape of global terrorism? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Joining me now from London is Justin Crump. He's a security analyst and CEO of Sibylline Limited. And also in London is Firas Abi Ali. He is the senior principal analyst for the Middle East at IHS. Thanks both so much for joining us. San Bernardino, Orlando, the German train, the French train, Nice. Are these attacks actually organized by Daesh, or are these just unstable individuals with violent tendencies acting out?
I think it's sort of symptomatic of a number of things. The messaging of jihadist groups has been evolving and getting better. Keep in mind that the lone wolves attacks is something that Al-Qaeda had been suggesting in its Inspire magazine for years. It's just that the Islamic State has been able to get this message across much more effectively and capitalize on the fact that there is a far broader than it should be acceptance of certain aspects of the jihadist narrative, driven by views of Islamic victimization, Islamic superiority, and a generally low threshold for violence.
Justin Crump?
Yeah, I'd agree completely. And I think
it's particularly notable, actually, the difference in how the different organisations have used media channels. Again, the Inspire magazine did reach a certain number of people, but the entire approach of Al-Qaeda and the jihadist networks of its time were much more basic compared to what we've seen Daesh use. So they're extremely good on social media. They've relied on actually what is the trend of the day. And not only that, but their messaging to people has been much more aggressive. So Al-Qaeda had a very defensive message. They said, you know, defend yourselves against the threat to Islam. Islamic State from the off has said, you know, you must be aggressive. It's absolutely your duty to use violence in any way you see fit. You know, and that is how you will achieve the ends that are required. So, you know, there's a very big difference, I think, from also the way, although the concept is similar, the way in which Al-Qaeda tried to push it is very different. And I think, you know, the lone wolf thing was almost a misnomer a number of years ago. There were a couple of good incidents like Needle Hassan, the Fort Hood shooter, but in general, it was actually pairs of people that launched the most successful plots up until a few years ago. And I think, you know, Daesh have shown that if you can take a lone actor and actually really make use of blunt instruments like a vehicle, like knives, and carry out something effective, you know, then that is a very powerful fear or way of spreading fear.
Firas, let me ask you, has social media actually been the key to enable people and enable Daesh to provide a so-called cause for otherwise, as I described them, unstable people with violent tendencies who really just want to go down in flames?
I think there's a little more to it than the idea that these are just violent people across the board. I mean, in every society and in every individual, there's a certain threshold for violence. I think that just as the Trump phenomenon has shown that there's a degree of latent racism, that there's a degree of latent anti-Semitism that has been emboldened and brought forward by the fact that this ideology actually exists, but in a more hidden form.
Justin, when we report these crimes and give them immediate media attention, sometimes without proof of actual associations, are we actually assisting organizations like Daesh in spreading fear and serving as a sort of PR machine for terrorist organizations?
Yeah, that's an interesting issue. If you go back to the trend in Northern Ireland over the last 20 years, it had very much been to downplay any issues of violence, to produce a narrative that didn't support the activities of the terrorists that remained in the province. And that was comparatively successful. I think the thing that's changed really is actually now that we have citizen journalism much more, we have social media, people are going to social media for news more quickly anyway, and I do feel that actually the mainstream media, even if it were to be more restrained, and there are some examples of channels that do, you know, I think almost play this card of fear and terrorism because it helps them with their own internal issues. I think nonetheless, you know, they'd be pushing against the tide of what people would actually go to for, if you like, the real news, and they would still go to social media channels. So to some extent, you need to be in that space, and I think one of the things that we've not been as good at as we could have been is sitting in the social media space and countering the narrative that is being put out. And indeed, that's across the board. So I think when these issues happen, the Germans actually have been very careful to try and downplay issues. I think there's a psychological reason for that. It's not always been successful. So if you look at the attack on the train station in Munich, they're very careful to say this was someone who had no link to Islamic State, that, you know, they had nothing, no connection to the movement. I mean, I think undeniably, whether or not it's someone with psychological issues, and many, many, many of these perpetrators inevitably have that problem, and certainly in the UK we've seen that. Nonetheless, you know, this is someone who was influenced by the narrative. They were influenced by what they were hearing, and I think the same with the Afghan yesterday. And I think, again, the change with that is that the Germans have acknowledged that this was someone who was inspired by jihadism. But I think, again, having a Daesh flag in his room made it kind of difficult to say that he obviously didn't enjoy some form of mental connection with the group. However, again, I doubt they had any connection directly with him whatsoever.
I would like to ask you both how you think Daesh actually compares to Al-Qaeda, and why has Al-Qaeda all but kind of faded into the background at this point? And do you think more lone wolves can identify somehow with Daesh than they could with Al-Qaeda?
I don't think it's faded into the background in any meaningful way. What's happened is that, for example, in the Syrian conflict, which gets a huge amount of the attention, the acceptance of Jabhat al-Nusra among the jihadi groups is very, very wide, and the acceptance of different bits and pieces of the narrative of Jabhat al-Nusra is actually quite wide. We need to sort of pay attention to that. If you look at the example of Saudi Arabia, for example, the Saudi society was nowhere near as radical when the Al Saud took over as they are now, perhaps, or have been over the last few years. The presence of these kinds of groups in places like North Africa, in, say, Mali, in Algeria, in Libya, and in Syria, is in fact giving them an air of respectability in certain areas where they say that, you know, at least Jabhat al-Nusra is a better alternative than the Islamic State. So perhaps Al-Qaeda has taken, has adopted a lower profile, but it's not gone in any way.
Justin, I see you smiling in agreement there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's an odd world where we're, you know, viewing Al-Qaeda as the better sort of jihadist to have, you know, relations with. It's I think, you know, there is a fundamental difference between the two groups, and I did a lot of work with former Al-Qaeda people in the last decade, and you know, they had a lot of people had joined around Bosnia, and again, this motive of come to defend Islam, very strong messaging around that, rather than an aggressive outpouring. And again, you know, in a way more thoughtful, more considered. A lot of their plots that were centrally directed didn't succeed because they were over-controlled, over-communicated, and they gave the security forces a great degree of opportunity to intercept and stop those plots. So I think Al-Qaeda's lack of success did cause it a crisis of credibility to some extent. This was heightened around the Arab Spring, although of course that movement benefited greatly. And of course falling out with Islamic State that had once been Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and obviously mutated into what we see now, and actually in a way back to its original roots with Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who again personified ultra-violence, personified actually a criminal with no Islamist background whatsoever, really, coming to Islam quite late and hooking on to the prophecies and the beliefs about the end of days that are very strong now with Daesh, and you see them you know, routinely, especially in the way they talk about Turkey at the moment, in Constantinople and things. So again, you know, a difference between the two movements. I'd say Al-Qaeda has a wider support base. It is probably better funded by donors than Daesh is. However, Daesh managed to achieve spectacular battlefield success, converted that to financial success, and has built an aggressive brand. And frankly, you know, their brand is much more attractive to watch when they push out media than Al-Qaeda's is. So Al-Qaeda will send, when it occasionally reaches out, an hour-long video of al-Zawahiri sort of sitting in a chair talking fixedly at the screen. They try and jazz it up with something behind him, but it's not particularly successful. And you compare that to this very strong narrative of victory and movement forward and, you know, success that Daesh is very good at putting out. And it's far less successful, obviously, in its portraying. But I think that's why a lot of independent actors now are hooking onto that as opposed to Al-Qaeda's brand. I think Al-Qaeda will endure when Daesh has been spread much more thinly. However, you know, it really has, that organisation really has gained credence and momentum from what's gone on now. But let's not forget, this is something that's cycled between insurgency and ground holding a couple of times before. It'll almost certainly try and do it again, and its own motto is to endure. So again, I think, you know, they have similar ultimate goals. They've definitely declared opposition to each other. But unfortunately, that'll probably stir. Sorry, Harris, go ahead.
Yeah, and just adding on to your point there, we are seeing a change of the narrative of the Islamic State that accommodates losses of territory, and that is intended to sort of ensure that the jihadi ideology endures. What we've seen between Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State is a kind of evolution, and the Islamic State is much more proficient at hooking into existing smuggling networks, criminal networks, in order to generate revenue that makes it independent enough to take on the more spectacular and more atrocious attacks that perhaps Al-Qaeda, worrying a little bit more about public opinion, has shied away from. But what has happened is that public opinion has gradually become numbed. And as it has become numbed, the acceptance of this kind of spectacular violence has grown with it.
How do you think governments could better go about fighting these lone wolf attacks, this lone wolf terrorism?
I mean, I'm sad to say it's an extremely difficult thing to do. One of the most destructive terrorist attacks we've seen, certainly by a single individual, was achieved with nothing more than effectively driving a truck into a crowded place. You can't possibly be vigilant against that. The security services in no country are so powerful that they can maintain observation of anyone who might possibly be radicalized. And unfortunately, the change in communication technology, the ability to issue communications to people over a wide band, lack of ability to sort of monitor who's actually seeing these communications and might be influenced by them, has all played down the ability of the security service to react to this threat, which is exactly why we're now seeing what we've made, to be honest, feared for many years now emerge. So there's a limit to what they can do. To some extent, we are relying, therefore, on the general public. And this is where I think, the vigilance, if you see something, say something, and those sorts of campaigns, as well as teaching people how to be prepared and also not to be scared. I mean, the fact remains, if you visit Germany, you're far more likely to be killed not wearing your seatbelt than you are by an act of jihadist terrorism. And, so if you're a traveller to Germany, one should bear that in mind. And yet, some people still don't wear their seatbelts. So, that's one of the things you've got to look at. So, but obviously it has that impact, which is why we've been discussing it. And, that will remain with us. And I'm afraid it will carry on motivating a fringe of society that's essentially suffering mental health issues for whatever reason. And, of course, the people who've lived with violence in Syria and in the Levant at the moment and have been brought up in that, and the generation that's experienced nothing but war, unfortunately, it'll take generations for that to recede and for the effect on those people to dissipate.
Okay.
This is a generational issue.
Justin, I will let you have the last word. I'd like to thank Justin Crump and Firas Abi Ali, thank both so much for joining us from London there. Still to come on the Newsmakers, killed to save face. We look at violence against women in Pakistan after the murder of social media star Qandil Baloch. And in Picture This, we take you inside the Republican National Convention in Cleveland. Qandil Baloch was anything but the status quo. She was often called the Kim Kardashian of Pakistan, known for her provocative social media presence and outspoken criticism of Pakistani society. She was a viral superstar who captivated the digital space. And it turns out those clicks cost her her life. Her brother confessed to strangling her to death, saying she violated the family's honor. Now, the Punjab provincial government has barred Qandil's family from forgiving their son in a step many critics say the national government hasn't been willing to take. Natalie Pohon has more.
Qandil Baloch was no stranger to controversy. She challenged Pakistan's conservative society through selfies and provocative stunts. And she wasn't sorry for it. Last month, she shared a video of a private meeting with a religious cleric drawing outrage and publicity. But her fame didn't save her. Qandil's brother, Mohammed Wasim, says he has no regrets about strangling her over her social media activities. This was one of her final postings on Facebook. As women, we must stand up for ourselves. As women, we must stand up for each other. As women, we must stand up for justice. Hundreds of women are killed by their male relatives under the guise of protecting a family's honour. The government estimates about 500 women are killed each year. But the country's Human Rights Commission says about 1,000 women were killed in 2015. Many of them on suspicion that they were having illicit relations with men, or because they chose to marry someone without the consent of their family. Like Zinat Rafiq, who was allegedly burnt alive by her mother. Punishment for these crimes isn't mandatory. Families can legally forgive the murderers if their daughters, sisters or wives are killed in the name of honour. Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif promised in February to change the loophole of legal forgiveness. But so far, the calls from protesters haven't been answered. So will Qandil Baloch's death be the one which forces the government to respond? Natalie Pohonen, The Newsmakers.
Joining me now from Islamabad is Farzana Bari. She is a Pakistani feminist and human rights activist, as well as the Director of Gender Studies at Quaid-e-Azam University. Thank you so much for joining us, Farzana. So as regards this latest so-called honor killing, from a Pakistani perspective, tell us, who is Qandil Baloch? Who was she? Who was this social media star in Pakistan?
I think she was a young woman who was clearly very rebellious and challenging the social morality and particularly the hypocrisy of social morality. And she's a woman who said, I want to live my life the way I want. And I think it was, in a way, she was kind of an anarchist, and in her way of challenging, the kind of the social norms, because I think she is a woman who has her own personal journey, which was quite a troubled one, whereby she was forced to apparently into a marriage, which was not of her choice. Later on, she ran away from the house, and she then tried to build her own life in her own way, while at the same time she was sporting, as you heard now after her murder, the father is saying that she was the one who was constantly supporting the family financially as well. So she was a kind-hearted woman, and also had certain...
Farzana, do you think Pakistan needed and needs someone like her, someone who challenges conventional views in Pakistan?
I think, of course, people have their own ways of contestation. I think there are many women who are challenging these traditional norms by asserting their choices. Of course, Qandeer Baloch has opted a way which was quite provocative, which is fine, I think, but I may not necessarily every woman in Pakistan will be choosing that sort of a pathway. However, I think there are many in Pakistan, and that's why, who are asserting their choices, who are making their choices, and as a result of that, they are getting killed. I think the rise in violences against women and organ killing is partly because the women in Pakistan is getting more empowered. They wanted to make their own choices. They wanted to choose their own life partners. They want to live their own life. They wanted to exit violent homes, violent situation, and as a result of that, they are also getting killed. We have increasing number of women who have been filing, in the court that they civil marriage, request and all that. That shows that the society is changing, and I think the men are finding it very hard to keep that traditional patriarchal control over women's lives and over their sexualities. And I think this is also, in a way, giving rise to that sort of, so the men are trying to keep that traditional control. And when they feel that the women are not going to, to live according to their wishes, that leads to also this extreme form of violence. Okay. And I think on the other hand,
I just wanted to ask you, while you say there's an increasing number of women challenging some of these social traditional norms, do you think Pakistan has gotten worse for women, or is there progress being made, or perhaps is it just stagnated?
I think Pakistan there are contradictory realities for women in Pakistan. If you look at generally the social indicators and the gender kind of development trends, for example, Global Gender Gap Index, Pakistan is consistently sliding down. However, I feel Pakistan is a society where particularly in the urban areas and for middle class women, the space is expanding. Women are there are more job opportunities, women are going into different fields, they are excelling in a lot of professions, But on the other hand, because of increasing poverty, radicalization, a lot of conflict, humanitarian crisis constantly Pakistan is facing. So I would say the majority of women who are living in far-flung areas or working class women, poor women, I think their lives are getting worse, And that's where we feel the trend of violence is also certainly on the rise in Pakistan, while our criminal justice system and state is completely faltering, in terms of giving protection to women, who are in need of protection. Even we don't have,
Farzana Bari, unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd like to thank you so much for sharing your insight on the Newsmakers from Islamabad. In today's Picture This, the Republican National Convention kicked off Monday in Ohio, where Donald Trump is trying to put the finishing touches on his presidential campaign. Let's take a look.
nation to know.
We want our children and all children in this nation to know
that the only limit to your achievements is the strength of your dreams.
To know that the only limit to the height of your achievements is the reach of your dreams.
Today on the Newsmakers, we asked how Daesh has changed the global perception of terrorism in recent years. On Tuesday, a 17-year-old man in Germany came at passengers on a train with an axe and a knife. At least 5 people were injured and the attacker was shot dead by police. Daesh has claimed responsibility for that attack and for other lone wolf attacks in Europe and the United States. But is Daesh really organizing them? Or is the group's ideology spreading through social media and propaganda video, inspiring mentally unbalanced individuals? You've been watching this edition of Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.